Hello again. Today our subject is empathy, a subject that has been so misunderstood and misrepresented that people think all kinds of things related to empathy. But in fact, the reason we're talking about empathy today is that empathy can help you or it can actually hurt you. If you have too much empathy or too little empathy or you're misapplying it, you are at a disadvantage. So let's look at this topic and see if we can make sense of it. Let me share my screen with you. And if you look at the top of my screen, you will see what it says. We're all different. Don't judge, understand instead. If you're really interested in the subject, the book, The Light in the Heart, is an interesting book to read because it helps you deepen your wisdom by making sense of your feelings. So, is your empathy hurting you or helping you? I'd like to begin by clearing up all the different names that we confuse or the different ideas that we confuse with empathy. Let's look at pity. Pity is when we look at something that is really horrific and we say, oh, that's terrible. And deep down, you don't want to see it. An example is if you see someone who is highly physically handicapped and deformed in some way. This is something which we feel very bad about. But one of the coping mechanisms is to depersonalize and not think of these people as people. And so we avoid, disengage. We don't really get involved. Second word is sympathy. That is probably the most maligned. Sympathy is not the same as empathy. Sympathy is when you feel sorry for another person. And deep down, it's a blend of fear and gratitude that it's not you. And when you offer people kind words of sympathy, the recipient feels diminished. They feel smaller. They don't really feel something of value for themselves. Charity is when we share something of our own wealth with those less fortunate. And in a way, we get something out of it because that gives us significance. We feel important. It gives us a sense of some kind of power and it eases our conscience. In some cultures, charity is associated with some beliefs and even superstitions. And it's really offering the proverbial fish, saying, here's a fish you can eat today. But empathy is a different story. Empathy is actually having enough respect for and interest in another person as a human being. And we care enough to find out what they're actually feeling. And then we're able to recognize when they're experiencing shame or joy or pain or other emotions. And the feeling that the recipient gets here is acknowledgement. They feel they have been seen and heard and recognized. And that's really important and very different from the other three. Compassion is taking it a step further. Compassion is genuine care and interest in the plight of other humans. And there is motivation to act, to communicate, or to offer some kind of comfort or solace to the other person. So we are moved to action here. And enabling, if you like, is the last step. Enabling is offering practical help so others can get themselves to a better and more sustainable place. And this is where we teach fishing instead of offering the fish. So yes, empathy is not the same as just feeling bad for someone or patting them on the shoulder. So what is it? What is empathy? Here is a definition: the ability to recognize, be sensitive to, and consider others' feelings, needs, and perspectives. The need to understand, to help, and work with others. Now, how can you do that if you don't first understand yourself, if you don't learn to read your own emotions and understand your reactions, and recognize what kind of filters you are using when you look at other people? What do you really see? Think about this little story. It's amusing, but it has a lot of interesting perspectives. A man checked into a hotel for the first time in his life, and he goes up to his room. 5 minutes later, he calls the reception desk and said, You've given me a room with no exit. How do I leave? The desk clerk said, "Sir, that's absurd. Have you looked for the door?" The man said, "Well, there's one door that leads to the bathroom. There's a second door that goes into the closet. And there's a door I haven't tried, but it has a do not disturb sign on it." So I wonder what you make of this story. What does this story signify? And what can we learn from it? Look at this image here. Here's a child with a candle, and he's got his curious little finger there. So what's he going to do? I'd like to present the idea that suffering is a choice, but pain is a response. What's the difference? Pain is a physiological reaction. If he puts his finger into that flame, it's going to burn. Now, he can choose what he does next. So the stimulus is the fire, the response is the pain. But what do we do? For example, when we experience fear, what do we do next? Some people will fight. If this child puts his finger on the fire and he feels pain and he's alarmed, he could fight. He could put the fire out and just stamp it out. No more fire. That's a fight. Faces the problem and deals with it head on. Or he might be so alarmed he runs away. And that's flight. It's run away from the problem. And the third possibility is to freeze, to do nothing, to become so alarmed that he keeps his finger in the flame. And that is where the concept of suffering is a choice comes from. When we experience a feeling, it's physiological. The burn, the pain from the burning is a feeling. What we associate with it is an interpretation. Is this a punishment for me? And if we believe that it is, that's when that emotional attachment, that interpretation to the physiology becomes an emotion. An emotion is a psychological response. So what can you do about this? How can you begin to make sense of your emotions and your level of empathy? How can you begin to separate what you're feeling from what other people are feeling and determining whether your empathy is helping you or hurting you? I suggest you start a journal. And in this journal, I'd like you to create 4 chapters. The journal can be a physical one or it can be a virtual journal. Chapter 1, you call blame. And what I want you to think about and observe is when you feel bad, and bad is a big generalization, when you're not feeling the way you want to feel. I want you to write it down. I want you to be, this journal is only for you. Nobody's going to look at it. So be really, really honest and say, who do you hold responsible for how you're feeling in that blame section? The second chapter, I want you to call guilt. And in that chapter, I want you to think about when you blame others for how you feel, what are you really giving away? What emotions are you building up internally? Because if you give the responsibility of how you feel to somebody else, you're actually giving them something. And what is that thing that you're giving them? And what is that going to cause you to experience internally? The third chapter, I want you to call judgment. And in that chapter, I'd like you to think about what gives you the right to decide that you know more about the thoughts and feelings of others than they do. Now, don't confuse things. I'm not talking about technical expertise. I'm talking about your belief that you know more about other people than they know about themselves. In here, I want you to look at the difference between understanding and judgment, and I want you to write your thoughts down. And the fourth chapter, I'd like you to call boundaries. What do you allow, who do you allow to cross your boundaries? And why do you permit that? When people, in a way, get you in a position where you do things you don't really want to do, you don't feel good about it. Why do you allow that? Who are the people you allow to go into that space? And what are the after effects when you feel your boundaries have been invaded and you are simply just being passive in this process. Every end of month, I'd like you to go back and read your journal and make sure you reflect on what you have written. You might have written in one chapter or you might have written in all. So I want you to go back and think about it and see what insights you might gain from this. So when we talk about deepening our empathy, a very important thing to recognize is that we have been given three brains. We have a heart brain, we have a gut brain, and we have our logical brain that's in our skull. Now, what do these represent? The heart brain has 40,000 neurons connected directly to our brain. So pulse rate, heart rate, blood pressure, all of these things are directly regulated. And those happen before any logical thought forms in our mind. Our gut brain has 500 million neurons. That's the size of a mature dog's brain in our gut. And that's our early warning system when things don't feel right. And the expression gut feeling comes from there. That is connected directly to your nervous system. And that is where our psychosomatic and psychogenic diseases come from, because it can affect our digestive system and a lot of other things in the hormonal balance within our body. These are all connected to your brain. So we have a logical brain and an emotional brain, and we have these other inputs where they trigger one another. So your emotional brain can trigger your logical brain to do things that you are reacting to without any real consideration. And so taking this concept of understanding how your emotions, how your empathy, your ability to feel and understand your experiences and feel and understand what other people are experiencing is extremely critical. Do you maintain a balance? Do you allow your emotions to take control? Do you focus only on the task and people feel ignored and unseen? And how does that affect your relationship and your ability to motivate and inspire people to work? Emotions drive behavior. So making a point of understanding how your empathy shows up in the world, how well you read yourself, how well you read other people, and what does that mean for you in terms of success and relationship management. If you're interested in going deeper into this subject, we have a really, really interesting workshop called Stop Saying Yes When You Mean No. Download the brochure, have a look at the content, and if you feel inspired to talk to us about it, we'd be happy to discuss how we can take this further.